Hello, everyone, and welcome to the California Fire Science Seminar Series. We're glad you're joining us this week. This week, I'm really happy to introduce Christine Wiedinmyer from the University of Colorado Boulder. Before I do her introduction, I want to do some sort of housekeeping and some thank yous for the hosts of the seminar series. So to begin with, the California Fire Science Seminar Series is hosted by the Fire Research Group at UC Berkeley, some funding from the School of Engineering, and myself at Berkeley, and co-hosted by Crystal Colden and Jeanette Cobian in Inguez from the University of California, Merced, are hosting this series. And so we're really thankful to those who are supporting us. Also, the California Fire Science Consortium has been our advertising partner. We'll be playing a bigger role as we come up next semester. So during the talk, we have a Q&A box on the bottom right. Please use that to ask questions. And at the end, we're going to be going through all those questions. I'll be reading them off and we'll have a chance to do that. And don't forget, we have a live discussion following the seminar for those who are here live. And that live discussion will take place at a link that will be shared and was also in the email sent to all participants. So now I'm really happy to introduce our guest today, Christine Wiedinmyer. She is the Associate Director for Science at CIRES at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And she is also a faculty in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at UC Boulder. She's a former scientist at NCAR and has a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from Tulane University and a PhD in Chemical Engineering from UT Austin. And I'm sure many of you have seen her work in pollution and air quality, and I'm really excited to see the work that's presented today. So thank you so much for coming, and welcome, Christine.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming. I'm sorry I can't see you all, but it's nice to see names on the side. I'll share my screen now and you all can let me know if it doesn't work out. Let's see. Can you see my screen? Is that good? Yes, no?
Not yet.
We even practiced this.
We practiced it twice.
I know. Hold on a second. It's share screen. One. Share. And then there. Now, can you see my screen? Is that good? Oh, now I can see you. Okay, perfect. So again, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to speak to you all today. And I'll talk a little bit about my work, and it's things that I've been working on for a long time. As Michael said, I am at the University of Colorado Boulder, and just a little background about us. We're right up against the foothills north of Denver, and CIRES, for those who don't know, is a cooperative institute with between the university and NOAA. So we actually have more than 400 research scientists who work embedded at the NOAA research laboratories in Boulder. And my primary job these days is to work and oversee our collaboration and our scientific endeavors at NOAA. And this is the aerial view of NOAA and Boulder, and this is what it looked like last October on the hill looking down. And as you all well know, in California, we had a lot of fires this last year, and it was really impressive. And what was crazy about this was like 3 different fires with the smoke plume going over Boulder and north of Boulder. Before I get going, I really wanted to acknowledge my collaborators. I have a lot. I don't do anything on my own, and I'm really fortunate to work with amazing people. So I'm not going to read them all off, but I really want to thank and appreciate all the people that I get to work with. And just a little bit about me. My research has really focused on looking at emissions of pollutants to the atmosphere, everything from greenhouse gases, reactive gases, particles, and how they impact air quality and change. And really, if we're going to clean up our air, to address climate issues, we really need to understand emissions. And so my whole career is looking at air pollution emissions. I started out looking at emissions from biogenic sources. These are trees And emissions from vegetation, undisturbed vegetation. Think about walking through a pine forest and smelling the pine forest smell. I looked at those compounds and how they impacted the atmospheric composition. And from that, I started looking at disturbances, and that came to fire and fire disturbances on the different vegetative ecosystems. And then I started looking at other types of biomass burning, and particularly residential. So today I'll only talk about my fire-related research, and I really want to acknowledge all the different funding sources that have enabled the research that I've done over the years. This is a map that's quite old, but at the same time, I think it really does a nice job of highlighting fire activity across the globe. This is just where the satellites see fire happening across the globe. This is anything that the satellite could see. So wildfires, prescribed burning, agricultural burning, land clearing. And the big thing I like to take away from here is, one, pretty much anywhere where we think we have vegetation, you see some kind of fire activity. And then two, it really highlights where the fires are across the tropics and the southern hemisphere. And this is, you know, not consistent throughout the year. Of course, these are episodic activities. So you can see that on a monthly basis, we have fire activity that occurs different places across the globe. For example, in September and October, you're going to see Southeast Asia light up. You can see some of the summertime activity in the continental US and North America. And then you can see the fire activity across Africa and South America. So again, these are global activities and global things that happen, but not consistent across the time of year. And my research is really focused on the emissions of that come from open burning. And just a side note, I'll show a couple of these photos. We were fortunate enough to work with a National Geographic photographer who came with us on several of our field studies in Ghana, and her name was Joanna Pinio. And so I'll be showing some of her photos. It's really nice to have some great photos to show along the way. And actually, this is one that I took, but just to give some background for those of you who are unaware, you know, fires emit smoke in general, but smoke is not one thing. It's a whole bunch of reactive gases like carbon monoxide, non-methane organic carbon, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen containing compounds. And then we also have greenhouse gases like methane and carbon dioxide. And then we have also hazardous air pollutants such as mercury and dioxins that are toxic to human health. And then we have a whole bunch of inorganic compounds that are part of particles, as well as black carbon and organic carbon. These are particulate carbon. That's either the black, mostly from flaming combustion, and then organic carbon from more smoldering combustion. So we're not talking about one thing. We're talking about a whole host of different things that have different impacts on human health, on air quality, on the climate. I started looking at fire emissions in the early 2000s. I got roped into this actually. Hey, could you come up with something quick and dirty to estimate fire emissions from North America for our air quality models? Because we're waiting for someone who's really good at this, but you can do it quick and dirty while we're waiting. And as a result of that, we ended up coming up with a North American fire emissions model. It's quite basic. However, it ended up getting used a lot and being pretty valuable for certain applications. And so we continued on to create the fire inventory from NCAR or FIN, which is a global model that has the spatial resolution of the satellite detections, daily resolution, temporal resolution, so it could be used for air quality applications as well as climate applications, and used for inventory development and other purposes. And there's the website. We just posted a new version of the emission estimates up online, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And just an aside, and I've said this before, but in case you all don't know, Finn is the name of my son. And I was in a group with Dr. Alex Gunther, who's now at UC Irvine. He made his biogenic emissions model called Megan after his daughter, the model of emissions of gases and aerosols from nature. And so when I came up with my model, I had to name it after my kid. So that's why it's named Finn. My daughter Maggie didn't have an F in her name, so it was harder to fit. So Finn got the model. When estimating the emissions from open burning, there's a lot of different ways of going about this, a lot of variations, but pretty much you need kind of two components. One, an emission factor, the mass of pollutant emitted per biomass burned. And these emission factors are a function of the vegetation, the type of vegetation that's burned, as well as the condition that's burned, as well as the fire, the intensity of the fire and the stage of the fire, smoldering versus flaming, for example. And then you need some information about what is burned, and what's burned will depend on, again, the vegetation type. A grassland will burn differently than an evergreen forest. The condition of the fuels, the density and the fuel loading. And and then again, like information about the fire, the intensity, the duration, etc. So basically, these are the components that go into estimating emissions from biomass burning. And you can see here, we can use satellite data. This is, so we would have from, say, MODIS, which is a satellite, a polar orbiting satellite that we use observations from. It tells us when and where fires moving or happening. And then we have different information from satellite or from the ground that tells us what the land cover looks like or the vegetation density looks like. And then we have these emission factors, and I have been fortunate to work with amazing instrument and measurement experts throughout my career that have been able to provide really great information about what is being emitted when a fire is happening. This is just a picture from Bob Yokelson from the Montana Fire Sciences Lab. They're loading up fuel here, they're burning it, the smoke goes into this flue, and then people can take measurements off of that or inside the building. Another way is to fly an airplane or have a ground-based measurement downwind of a fire so that you can measure the components outside and inside the plume and get an estimate of what's being emitted through the plume in a real burn. As you all may know, there was huge field campaigns in 2019 and 2018 funded by NASA and NOAA and NSF to really get a better understanding of emission factors across Western US landscapes, and then what happens to those emissions once the pollutants are emitted into the atmosphere and happens downwind. So I know that you have many experts in the area who have looking at that. So this is, again, just actually a relatively small table of an example of compounds that are emitted in fire plumes. So you have greenhouse gases, these hydrocarbons, compounds containing nitrogen, particles. And the big points I would love for you to take home today is, smoke is not just one thing. It has many different compounds. Some are hazardous, and they can have different impacts when they're in the atmosphere. And so it really depends on what scientific questions or what policy relevant questions you want to ask to determine what's best to look at or examine in the fire plume. Fire emissions globally are really, really large. This is not an insignificant source of pollution to the air. And this is just a pie showing the relative carbon emitted to the atmosphere from open burning from across the globe compared to what's emitted from fossil fuel combustion. So again, it's small relative to fossil fuel combustion, but it's not an insignificant piece of the pie. And then if we start looking at these reactive gases, I have carbon monoxide here, nitrogen oxides here, and then these non-methane organic compounds. The red is what's coming from open burning, gray is from anthropogenic sources, and green is from biogenic sources. You can see globally, biomass contributes more than 50% of the carbon monoxide. A relatively small piece of the nitrogen oxides, but a rather large piece of the non-methane organic compounds. This green is dominated by isoprene and other biogenic non-methane organic compounds to the atmosphere. One thing I like to note here is, like, I made the slide probably 7 or 8 years ago, and this number was a third of what it is, what we're calculating now. This 310, it was around 100. And I think we've been able to really better understand the non-methane organic compounds that are emitted from fires because of our just exponential increase in the ability to identify and quantify these compounds and new compounds and different compounds in fire plumes. So because of our incredible chemists, we've been able to really better understand this piece of the pie. When we look at particles, biomass burning dominates globally. You can see this is PM 2.5. These are the fine particles that can be inhaled and cause health impacts. We also have a particulate organic carbon and black carbon. So you can see that particulate emissions are dominated globally by biomass burning. And actually, if we consider open burning plus the burning that happens at the residential scale, this cooking, which I'll talk a little bit about at the end of my talk, you can see that, you know, almost 3/4 of the global black carbon and more than 90% of the organic carbon is emitted from burning a biomass. So it is a huge source. It is essential for us to get a strong grasp on this if we're going to understand the climatic impacts of particles in the air, which is a huge still uncertainty in our climate models. Biomass burning has impacts, as I mentioned, on air quality, on weather and climate, and then ultimately on public health. And I just wanted to talk about a few things. You all in California know what you lived through last September, where you had huge smoke, huge fires going. The satellite imagery was just amazing. And you can see that this fire was, you know, the smoke was not limited to the Western US, but you can see it being transported across the United States. So it's not just a local or a regional problem, it's a continental issue. And our models were able to predict the emissions and the transport of the particles all the way across the country. I invite you to check out this new smoke product that was actually developed here in Boulder. It's called the HER Smoke forecast. It's available that you can actually look at smoke forecasts, both vertically integrated, so this is throughout the column of the atmosphere, or at the surface. And this was widely used during the fires last summer. And you can see that the smoke really impacted the air quality, as I know you all know, across the Western United States, and even you could see influences of it across the entire contiguous US. And this is not unique to last year. This is a paper that was published a few years ago, but I really appreciate what it really had to say. And one is, if you're looking across the Western United States, you know, maybe 20 to 25% tops of the surface particles that we breathe in are attributed to wildfire smokes during the wildfire seasons. And this is over a 5-year period. But if we look at only those days where the particles went above levels that are considered healthy, that went above PM 2.5 greater than 35 micrograms per meter cubed, you can see on those days, fires contributed almost all of that surface PM. So again, it's not a constant problem, but the days that we are most impacted by bad air quality and bad particle levels, those are really driven by fire. So across the Western United States, fire is really driving our air quality problems. And this is not unique to the US. We've been looking a lot in Southeast Asia. For example, in 2015, there were huge fires across Southeast Asia. It was an El Nino year, and it really dried out. And then the fires that happened across Sumatra and Borneo really went crazy in September and October. This is just a satellite image. You can see the red dots where the fires are and the smoke that just really encompassed the whole region. it made huge news. This was a huge problem for a really large population. Indonesia's fire labeled a crime against humanity. This also became a big political issue because the fires were happening in Indonesia. Countries like Singapore and Asia and Malaysia were significantly impacted. So there's a lot of political issues surrounding open burning in this part of the world as well. And these are just some photos from Singapore about what it looked like on a clear day versus when there's fires were going on. I'm sure you all have very similar pictures in San Francisco from last summer. But so what we're trying to do is look at the air quality impacts from these fires, show where they went, where the sources were. And so we came up with an inventory of the emissions and then put them into an air quality model to simulate the emissions and transport and chemistry of those. So you can see that the model did a pretty good job of looking at the fires and how the smoke really encompassed the whole area and how the fire smoke actually really impacted Singapore and Malaysia. And we use surface observations to help us understand how well the model was doing. For this particular run, we did fairly well. We know in other times we didn't, and I'll talk a little bit about the uncertainties in just a bit. And again, I really think that we should think beyond just the air quality impacts, but the whole feedbacks between weather and climate. And we know that these fires emit aerosols. We also know that trace gases can react and to form secondary organic aerosol in the atmosphere. The aerosol can impact radiation directly, either through absorbing or scattering it. And they can also act as ice nuclei or cloud condensation nuclei, and so affect the way that clouds are formed. And by that process, they can impact the radiation that gets through the atmosphere, as well as control some of the precipitation processes. So there's a lot of work looking at the different components of this whole cycle. One of the things that I think is really important from an air quality perspective is that we don't just want to put the aerosols and gases into the models and just push them around. I think it's really important to have these feedbacks so that we better understand the chemical processes. So a few years ago, some colleagues of mine and we tried to simulate some fires going on in Idaho and Montana. And this is just a satellite image of the fires and the smoke and where they happen to be and how large. But we wanted to look at how the feedbacks of the radiative processes actually fed back into the meteorology and the chemistry. And what we found was that by including all these feedbacks, we actually get very different simulated surface air temperature, for example, and boundary layer depth downwind from the fires that can have a large feedback to our estimated chemistry. For example, we saw changes as much as 60% increases in ozone concentration downwind when we included these feedbacks compared to the simulations that we ran without these feedbacks. So again, if we want to understand the downwind air quality impacts from fires, I think it's really important that we include these processes and feedbacks. And then I am fortunate enough to work with and collaborate with some really amazing people who are experts in the health impacts from fires. And there are so many, associations between wildfire smoke exposure and respiratory morbidity, premature mortality, and then other things such as potential birth outcomes. The birth outcomes have been fascinating to me because they also are related to some of the cook stove work that I'm interested in. But one of the first studies that I saw that looked at birth outcomes from fire exposure on the pregnant mom looked at the fires in Southern California in 2003, and they looked at women who were pregnant before, during, and after a wildfire event. And they found that exposure to wildfires during pregnancy led to significantly lower birth weights. And this has just been reinforced in a really recent paper 2 years ago from some colleagues of mine in Colorado. And they found similar results where they saw exposure to wildfire PM 2.5 during pregnancy was linked not only to decrease birth weight, but also to gestational diabetes and gestational hypertension. So I think we're still learning a lot about the health outcomes and different ways that being exposed to wildfire smoke can impact our health. This is a recent paper that just came out, I guess, a month or two ago, looking at global contribution of biomass burning to surface PM 2.5 concentration. And this figure is just from the paper. It's showing the average the fire PM 2.5 relative to the total PM 2.5. And they used that to look at who and how often different populations were exposed to elevated and unhealthy levels of PM 2.5 due to biomass burning. One of the things that here's some of the top countries whose populations have the greatest exposure to harmful levels of landscape fire emitted ambient PM 2.5. And you can see US is one of the top. So we are definitely not exempt, even though we don't have as much fire as some other places around the globe. But this study actually almost doubled the earlier estimate that I saw of global premature deaths due to landscape fire smoke exposure. And they're estimating almost 700,000 premature deaths per year. So it's fairly significant and something that, again, wildfire smoke exposures, understanding emissions is really important. And Newman et al. Just recently tried, this has a huge impact. Oh, sorry. How do I get rid of that? Sorry, this is total economic damages from health impacts. And you can see, even now it's estimated that, $7 to $10 billion are being, is the cost of human health impacts due to exposure to wildfire health. And this is only expected to get much worse. These are two different lines depending on two different climate scenarios moving forward in time, but you can see that the cost of these health impacts is significant and not something that we should ignore or can ignore. Sorry, I'm not sure how to get that, but there's a lot that we know and a lot we still have yet to find out about emissions, air quality impacts, and what happens to those emissions in the atmosphere. When I started the fire emission estimates, it's really right away, I'm constantly told, well, this is right, this is wrong, this looks good, this doesn't look good. And, there's a lot of reasons why our estimates aren't good. One of them is because I'm looking globally with FIN, I'm using satellites to tell me when and where a fire happens. And if you use one satellite observation versus another, you would get very different answers. For example, this is MODIS fire detections over 2 days. And if I add in another one, goes 4-meter resolution, active detection, you get very different fire detections. So you could imagine if I drove the model with only these fire detections versus all of these, I would get very different answers. One of the things that I really struggle with, would love to follow up someday with some people from California, because I know the West Coast is somewhere where my model struggles, is the land cover that I assume is burning in a fire. Right now I'm using the MODIS land cover type product. I simplify it down here to grasslands, woody shrublands, tropical forest, temperate forest, and croplands. So you can see the dark green as the forested area. If I look at another satellite-derived global land cover product, the globe cover, and simplify those land cover classifications to the same 5 generic codes, the maps look completely different. So you would imagine if I'm running my fire emissions model with this land cover, I would have a lot more shrubland and grassland burning, whereas this one I would have a lot more forest burning. Forest has a lot more woody fuel to burn and therefore would have a lot higher emissions than, say, a shrubland or a grassland. So when I look at a specific fire, I might be able to get really good information, but the second as I start looking at continental and global scales, it's much harder to know what's right or how to best characterize the land cover. And this is just an example of two different models over, I think, a week-long period showing the emissions using the Blue Sky Smart Fire versus the Fin version 1 model. And you can see that the locations of fires might be different. The magnitude of the fire emissions, it might be different. And so it is very challenging, because if we use different fire emission factors, fire locations, timing, fuel loadings, fuel consumption, these all lead to uncertainties in our emission estimates. Tess Carter with Colette Held at MIT just recently looked at just North America and the contiguous US, and they looked at different emission inventories. This is GFED, FIN, QFED, which is out of a NASA model, and GFAS, which is a European model, to look at this is just organic carbon emitted from these 4 different models. And you can see that, they can be as much as 2, 3, a factor of 2, 3 different, depending on where we look. And it's not consistent. The contiguous US looks very different than boreal North America. What they did was they put these different inventories into a climate model to look at the radiative feedbacks. And, and it was very, very different depending on what inventory you use. So the global inventories, they showed that these vary by a factor of 4 in North America, and then it has huge impacts on our ability or to model the radiative effect of smoke. And so it's a huge uncertainty, and again, it really drives the need for us to better understand this particular source. So we still have a long way to go. We're right now working on the next version of FIN. In fact, someday I'll write the paper in the near future, but we've recognized some shortcomings in the way it was running. So we've done an updated burned area estimation method, including VIRS data, which helps us get some of the smaller fires, and included other, I think, better updated information about emission factors and fuel loadings. And right now we're able to run those emissions and with an air quality model and compare them to all the extensive measurements that were done during WCAN in 2018 and then FireXAQ in 2019. And so we're trying to figure out when and where we do a good job, where we still need improvements. Another thing that we're working on, and this is with my collaborators, Kelly Barsanti at UC Riverside and Amory Carlton at UC Irvine, and then my colleagues, Louisa Emmons and others at NCAR, is looking not only at the emissions total, but looking at how we take the emissions from the measurement side and put them into the model in the best way possible. One of the challenges that I have is the chemists and the measurements that are happening now is just, again, amazing. I have colleagues who give me a list of 700 compounds that they've been able to identify and quantify in fires, in fire plumes. And my challenge is, okay, I have hundreds of compounds. How do I get them shoved into this model that maybe has 20 categories for these organic compounds? And it really is an issue. A lot of these mechanisms that simulate air quality and chemistry in these models are based on urban air quality and might not be the same as what's being emitted in fires. So there's still a lot we need to learn about how best to simulate all of this information that's being collected into our air quality models to get the best forecasts and predictions of air quality outcomes. So, so what we've been doing is looking at the default way that we lumped, and I'll say lumped or speciated all these VOCs. And we also came up with, working with a new mechanism out of NCAR, and then using all these new compounds. This default was based on the measurements that were made before 2011. And now we have hundreds of new compounds that were identified. And so now we're putting these compounds into different categories. And if we run them through a box model that simulates the chemistry downwind of this fire plume, this is under different NOx backgrounds. You can see that, okay, just not by changing the total organic compounds that we're putting into the model, but just changing the way that they're speciated into the chemical mechanism, we can get, as much as 10 ppb difference in simulated ozone just by changing the assumptions that we make about where those VOCs fit into the chemical mechanism. And that's pretty significant. And if we start looking at other compounds such as formaldehyde, these are, MPAN, and these are terpene oxidation products that might go towards secondary organic aerosol concentration formation. You can see just by changing our assumptions about where these VOCs go, we could get very different chemical outcomes. So I think this is something that Kelly Barsanti is really looking at a lot further, and we're working towards at least trying to understand the impact of some of our assumptions and make recommendations for what is best to put into the model so that we get the best simulated outcomes. I'll spend a few minutes before the end of this talk just to talk about some of the other things that I've been working on. Like I said, I was looking at fires and then started thinking about what other types of biomass burning. And this is really cooking and cooking over biomass. Also, it's not really necessarily waste burning, or biomass burning, but some parts it's just open waste burning altogether. And for those who don't know, there's nearly 3 billion people in the world who cook food and heat their homes with traditional cook stoves or open fires. So they have open fires in their houses. And that's estimated to lead to at least 4 million premature deaths each year, primarily in women and children. So this is a huge global issue. And when I started looking at this, my colleagues and I started a cook stove intervention study in northern Ghana. So this is Ghana, it's in West Africa, the capital Accra is here. We were working in the north, right on the border of Burkina Faso. We had a study called Reacting, and I'd be happy to talk to anyone more about this. But we looked at the intervention of using 2 different stoves. One, a stove that was designed locally, that's just a more efficient stove as opposed to having 3 rocks, which is how people traditionally cook there, and then a forced gasifier stove that required power. The study was really comprehensive and one of the most productive things I've done in my career. Katie Dickinson, who led the overview paper, is actually an environmental economist, but we had engineers, we had air quality experts, we had health experts. It was just phenomenal, and a great team from Ghana as well as in the US. And work is still continuing. Katie's still leading efforts there with Mike Hannigan from Mechanical Engineering at CU. But we had air quality monitors. We were monitoring the stoves themselves. We looked at exposure, personal exposure of the household members, as well as the children. And we also did a lot of emission measurements. One thing that's important, and one of the challenges, is to understand the contribution of cook stove and cooking emissions in across Africa, across South America, across Asia, relative to other sources of particles and pollution. And so we were hoping to take measurements to better understand the emissions and how much this particular source contributed to household, local, and regional air quality. And one of the things that came about from working there was I realized that they had few or no waste management at all. And so people just burn their trash everywhere. And when I started looking, and this was a few years ago, but I realized that the emissions from open waste burning really wasn't well characterized or considered in a lot of our air quality and climate models. So my colleagues from EPA and University of Montana and I took what limited data were available and came up with an inventory to look at the emissions of air pollutants from open waste burning. And so we have an inventory. My colleague Eloise Murray is updating that now, and there's been some really great measurement campaigns, for example, in Nepal, that will really help better characterize the emissions that are emitted from this source. This has led to some other work that I've done on emissions from Africa, just in general. Eloise Murray led this work, taking the trash burning as well as other cooking emissions and looking at other incomplete combustion sources. The charcoal production is a huge one, to look at how large those emissions were in Africa and how quickly they are changing. And you can see here we have multiple studies. Our study is in black. We did 2 different years here, the red and the blue, and these other dots are from other inventories. So you can see that our understanding of these emissions is still highly variable. So again, if we're going to understand air quality and climate, and particularly globally, we really need to get a better handle on the emissions from Africa. And not only is open burning a really important source of fires in Africa. If you remember back from one of my first slides, you can see that Africa lights up every year. Some of the most active fires are across the continent, sub-Saharan Africa. And then we have all these other sources of emissions. It's really important that we better constrain them so that we can understand the air quality problems there as well as climate. I'm continually to work on FIN, and as I mentioned, I'm happy to talk to anyone after this about the emissions estimates and how they're being used and how people can get them. I'm part of a Belmont Forum study that we're looking at fires in Alaska and in Scandinavia and Russia and how they impact air quality, and working with indigenous groups to better understand perceptions and health impacts from those communities in the different regions because of wildfire activity. I'm also continuing to work in Southeast Asia. It's again one of the biggest areas of fire activity where they have smoke and air quality impacts on such large populations. And looking at the impact of peat, right now, GFED includes peat burning, but FIN did not until I started working with a colleague who's actually going to come to Riverside, I believe, who included a peat burning component for FIN, and we'll be continuing to improve that. Working on air quality management in developing countries and coming up with strategies there. I have some really great projects with Leroy Westerling at UC Merced and his team, and Miriam Marlier at UCLA, looking at fires in California and the Western United States, and not just now, but into the future. And I'll always continue to work on inventories. And I think I have, I'm gonna skip a slide real quick. Sorry. So just, this is like completely off topic. I'm sorry, but this is another work that I'm working on that I'm really excited about. Is looking at biogenic VOCs, or volatile organic compounds, from the cannabis industry. So again, many of you might have smelled cannabis in the past and knows it has a very strong odor. Well, those plants actually have a lot of monoterpene emissions. Monoterpene can react with ozone. They can form secondary organic aerosol. And so I've done some work with my colleague, Will Visuete from UNC Chapel Hill, and his former student, Chitsan Wang, to look at the emissions from this particular source. We focused on Colorado. In Colorado, all of the growing operations have to be indoors and locked, unlike California, where they have outdoor growing operations. What's interesting about Colorado and struck me very much is that okay, so they're growing all these plants and they're actually processing them in commercial warehouse space, and the commercial warehouse spaces predominantly are along the major traffic corridors. So you would have these potentially large VOC sources right next to big sources of NOx. And for those of you who don't know, when you combine VOCs and NOx in the summertime, you can get ozone. And so the question was, one, how much do these plants emit? Two, how much gets out? So can we measure them around, say, Denver and Boulder? And then three, how much might these emissions impact air quality? And so Will and Chitzon have led this work to really follow these through. And these are just 3 papers, but it was kind of fun and different. And I think it's still an evolving issue. And I know the cannabis industry and California have wildfire, I guess just community have interacted just because of the outside grows. And if the cannabis fields that are in some of the forested areas burn, you could have some issues. So I'll leave it there. I also wanted to point out we had a National Academies workshop last fall. And I thought it was outstanding just because it included everything from the first day, really physical sciences, scientists trying to understand the emissions and air quality impacts. But then we had sessions on looking at local and regional public health experts talking about some of the questions that they have and really the gaps between understanding and doing the basic research and how to actually apply it. So and provide information that's useful for warning and how to best communicate. So the link is here. And again, I encourage people to check it out. It was really great. And just another opportunity to learn about these intersections between the science, the policy, the public health, and the communications. So I'll leave it there. And I guess, yeah, I'll leave for questions. And again, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. And should I close the slide or?
You can leave it up in case anyone wants to reference it. So we'll do a virtual applause. Thank you so much. And yeah, we've got one question in there. I've got a whole book full of questions, so if other people don't have them, but we'll start. There's a question from Hadi Hajlu. And he asked if you were also working on obtaining any database pertaining to emission factors from structural fuels, like in WUI, as exposed to vegetation.
That is an amazing question. I have been looking. I have found very, very little. So if you have any ideas or anyone on this call has any ideas, I would love to learn more. I know this is a big question that I talk with my public health and epidemiology expert friends about how important the emissions are from the burning of urban structures and just structures when they're mixed in with wildfire and just biomass emissions. So I have a small list, but it's all old and it's not current. Just so people are aware, right now there is a National Academies of Sciences committee right now looking at urban fires and air quality and impacts of urban fires and structural burns as part of that. I know they're going to have a workshop in June, so keep an eye out on that. I'm sure it'll come up on the National Academies website. But yeah, please follow up with me if you have any other information. I think that's
yeah. Well, I can share. I know I saw a great talk from Amara Holder at the EPA. Actually did, I mean, she used some data from Margaret McNamee, who's now at Lund University in Sweden, but we've done some work, not me personally, but the fire community, structural fire, has done some looking at what comes off whole buildings. And so there's some knowledge that can be shared there. And we've applied for other funding to fill in some of those WUI gaps and haven't been successful, but I think it's on a lot of people's radar, and hopefully there can be some merging from the wildland and structural side to tackle it?
Yeah, I think there's so many questions still to be answered there. Yeah, they're real, and it is a gap between the two communities that needs to come together. So I will be following up with you. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So we have another question from Alan Goldstein,
Hi, Alan.
from Berkeley over here. So he had a question on controlled burning and is likely to be used more in the Western US, at least in California, in the coming years. Have you considered adding controlled burn emissions into FIN?
Yes, yes. The challenge that I have is that, since all of our missions are driven by the satellites only see the fire. They don't tell me if it's how it was started. So in the US, we can use other additional information the same way that Blue Sky does to help inform the way the fire was burned and started. But again, I think those efforts are, I don't know, for the US Blue Sky, they're doing such a good job. I don't know. I'll follow up with you, but right now it's really hard for us to get at that since we only use fire detection. So it is a challenge, but I agree. We can look at it different ways as well, like changing the fuel consumed. Matt Hertel and I did a paper in 2009 looking at prescribed burning just across the US, but it was a scenario paper and not reality, let's just say. So does the satellite detect? Oh, I don't know. That's a good, so Alan just asked, does the satellite detect most controlled burns? No. Particularly in the Southeast US, we miss a ton due to the timing of the overpasses, as well as a lot of these fires happen at the understory level, and so the satellite can't see them. I'm hoping, and we're looking at this a little bit more with CIRES and some of the newer products and the GOES product, if we can get better timing and see if we see some smaller fires that might be more considered control. But it is a really big limitation of using the satellite products. And then getting the other information is challenging too, because then you have, you're based on reports, and some states have great reporting and others do not. And so, yeah, getting at the control burns is a really big challenge. The group at Georgia Tech has done a nice job, at least in the Southeast, looking at that a little bit more. So, yeah.
So I had a question. I've asked it before to different people doing, emissions estimates. So in your opinion, we know that, you're missing information between satellite passes. We don't know the local fire behavior. And besides the emission factors, we also don't always know how that fire behavior translates to the actual fuel consumed, because that's another correlation. So in your opinion, where do you think the biggest error or the most important things to focus on are? If you were to inspire the folks who aren't in the field, what should we do first?
If I had to focus on one place to help my model, it actually would be in the fuel, and the fuel that was burned and how much it was burned. As you saw from that vegetation map, I can get factors of like 10 and 20 difference in my emission estimates just by using a different inputs to the fuel loading, whereas the emission factors are uncertain, but not by that large, at least not for the majority of the compounds. And, because I'm modeling at such coarse scale, the fire spread is not, again, like I don't want to negate any of those other things, because it really depends on what question you're asking and what you're trying to get at. But I think from my model at these regional and global scales, getting at the fuel and the fuel burned is really, really important. So, and then figuring out how better to detect the fires. Like Alan said, if we could get at the controlled burns and the stuff that happens on the understory, we would pick up a lot more. So, yeah.
That's great. Yeah. There's a lot of work to do always.
I mean, that's why, like, and every time we improve it already, we just released a new version, and within days, I'm already finding out where there's shortcomings and places that we still need to work on. So yeah, I guess I'll be in business for a while, I guess, but there's
Yeah.
some things we can do really well and some things that just need a lot of improvement. So
yeah. So there was a question on if you had seen or did any work relating COVID and smoke health effects.
yeah, I did not, but if you go to that workshop, one of our special speakers was from British Columbia, and she had just started looking at the connections between PM 2.5 and COVID. It was last summer, so I think the research is really new. But and I forgot the person's name who spoke, but again, I only heard it talk. I don't know anything myself. So, but I don't know, this is how I got into the work in Ghana is, I mean, totally off top, well, random, but there are meningitis outbreaks across the Sahel, or there used to be, and people who studied the disease found that the biggest drivers of someone getting meningitis during an epidemic was either being in close proximity to someone with meningitis, or two, cooking with biomass. And so the hypothesis was that people who are cooking with biomass, breathing in smoke all day, have compromised lungs or compromised immune systems that lead to them being able to get meningitis easier. And so I think that's some of the hypotheses with COVID. But I think we're waiting. Oh, thank you, Tess. It was Sarah. No, yeah, I think it was Sarah Henderson. Thank you, Tess. Yes. And so, yeah, I would follow up. You can look at one of the talks about the work that was at least done by last fall, but I think that's still an evolving topic. And I think it's really interesting since last summer was such a major fire year and so many people were involved, exposed, and there was so much data collected. We might be able to get some really good information out of that.
All right, and so in the interest of time, we've got one last question, but I'm going to save the other questions that went in for the discussion in the chat. So don't forget to check out our link for the Zoom discussion following. The last question is from Will Lastman. Does FIN use fire radiative power, fire radiative energy to constrain the mass of fuel that is burned?
No, actually, so thank you. No, so some models like QFED use FRP to predict the fuel, the biomass burned, and no, we just use a parameterization from an earlier model. Since it started that way, it's continued. And I think, there's strengths and weaknesses to each method. So I think the FRP method still relies on biomass, understanding what's burning underneath. And so, yeah, I feel like, again, there's strengths and weaknesses, but we do not. We just use a parameterization of how much is burned, yeah, based on the land cover type.
All right, so thank you. So just in the interest of time, I don't think we have time for another question, but I've saved these, so we'll pick them up in the discussion after.
Okay, yeah, please save them.
Unless you think you can handle one in 2 minutes.
No, that's right. No, they're big ones, but I'll save
I know.
them. Thank you for asking.
But there's some really interesting. So for those live, please join us on that other link. We're going to load it in a second. And thank you again for attending our seminar, and we will see you next week. So thank you again, Christine, for a great talk.
Thank you for having me. And thank you everyone for coming.